it's time to show what happened to our huge terrarium. As of the release of this video, the project is already 26 months old. And for 9 of those months, it has existed as a closed ecosystem without our intervention. Since we last showed it to you, a lot of interesting things have happened. And we filmed this video about all of that over the course of a year. We should start with the not so pleasant things. When the second part of the huge terrarium was released on the channel, my partner and I were already in another city and almost no one was keeping an eye on the terrarium. Maybe once a week a few cockroaches were thrown in for the lizards and some food for the crayfish. And by the time we arrived, the green, vibrant terrarium looked like this. Almost all the green grass has turned into yellow hay. And the water level in the pond dropped to 5 centimeters. It's not hard to guess that the problem arose due to the lack of a lid on our terrarium. It was decided to completely overhaul the entire ecosystem again. We still didn't know what had happened to the lizards, the macrays, the ants, and everyone else. But at first glance, it was clear that the crayfish definitely survived. And not only did they survive, but they also reproduced. If you don't remember, there were 2 of them. And now we see that these underwater cockroaches have caught and eaten all the fish. They devoured absolutely all the vegetation and, as we will understand later, even our beautiful driftwood. Only a couple of sticks are left from it, but now instead of 2 crayfish we have 5 and they aren't stopping. It seems like, why reproduce any further when you're left in an empty terrarium where there definitely won't be enough food and space for everyone? But apparently they don't think about that. The female carried the eggs under her tail for about 3 weeks. Some of the eggs fell out of there and immediately became food for the other crayfish. It was decided that the crayfish had no place in our terrarium. They destroyed the entire underwater world of our terrarium, turning it into a desert. So the crayfish packed their crayfish things and moved to the aquarium, where our tea jellyfish once lived. They were relocated along with the aquarium substrate, stones, and the remnants of the driftwood. And soon the female gave birth to several little crayfish, which were eaten by their older brothers within a couple of days. What are these animals doing? How can you kill your own brothers? Day 2. The disassembly of the terrarium continued. We were slowly taking out the stones, remnants of vegetation, and rotting pieces of wood from it. The terrarium showed no signs of life, except for a few green blades of grass. But suddenly our watchful eyes caught sight of her. The ladybug was quietly sitting on a clump of dirt. We didn't introduce her here, and several possible theories immediately crossed my mind. She definitely flew in by herself. Maybe she was looking for food. What if our ants started a farm, aphids and ladybirds, as they love it? She came to feast on them. But this grand story came crashing down because of one fact. Yes, she was dead and dried up. We continued to dig up our terrarium. We got rid of the stream that flowed alongside it and the stones from which this stream originated. After a while, hope awakened in us. An ant was running along the glass of the terrarium. And not just running, but doing its job and dragging either a stick or some kind of seed somewhere. From that moment on, the excavations became more careful, to avoid harming the survivors of such a catastrophe in the terrarium. And it was for good reason, as we almost immediately discovered simply. Swarms of millipedes. They burrowed into the ground about 10-15 centimeters, down where there was still some moisture. After a few minutes of digging into the depths of the terrarium, we came across a healthy earthworm. And when we dug down to the base of the huge log that took up almost the entire underground volume of our ecosystem, we saw, this is what the picture looked like. In the previous video, we showed you that the ants gnawed through the gypsum house with tunnels and chambers that were standing by the glass and went to live deeper in the terrarium. And now, judging by their numbers, we could say for sure that there were ants here. That's actually very good. From a couple of dozen individuals released here at the start of the terrarium, a pretty decent colony has grown. Probably no less than a few hundred ants. Seeing this, we stopped digging and carefully covered it up. The base of the log is covered with soil. Unfortunately, we couldn't find our 3 lizards that were dominating the terrarium. Most likely, due to the unbearable conditions, they decided to escape and try their luck somewhere else. It was summer outside, so they still had a chance to survive. After thoroughly cleaning the terrarium from the inside, we sealed its weak seams with silicone that were leaking water. And then we started another renovation of the terrarium. This is already the third attempt, and this time we are seriously determined to create a perpetual terrarium, where the water and energy cycles will work. For the ecosystem to function without our intervention, all inhabitants, from bacteria to serious predators, must be provided with an endless supply of food. We won't be able to add food to the terrarium, so the only solution is for the food to grow by itself inside. The only living beings capable of creating food from energy are plants. Fortunately, all they need is light, that very energy, soil, water, and carbon dioxide. Next, these plants are eaten by herbivorous animals. Scientifically, they are called primary consumers. After that come the predators. These are secondary consumers. They eat those who eat plants. And then all that's left is to destroy the remains of dead plants and animals and turn them into fertilizers for new plants, to complete the cycle. This work is done by decomposers. These are bacteria, worms, pillbugs, and our crayfish. By the way, that's true too. But we won't bring them back here. It is precisely thanks to decomposers and producers, that is, the destroyers of dead matter and the plants that create new matter, that it functions. The endless cycle of life. This is what an ecosystem is. At each of these biomass levels, the amount decreases significantly. If we want to have at least one serious predator in the terrarium, let's say a spider, we need to provide a food base that far exceeds its weight. Beetles and cockroaches. And there should also be a food base ready for them that far exceeds their weight. So it turns out that the most important thing in an ecosystem is plants. This is the foundation of food for all living beings. So this time we planted in the terrarium not just lawn grass and a decorative tree, but a bunch of different edible plants. From spinach to carrots, at least something from this should not only grow well, providing the next level of the ecosystem with food, but also giving seeds so that the cycle can start all over again. But still, it's a decorative tree we planted. When the ecosystem was first launched, the terrarium was decorated with a myrtle tree. But, as it turned out, it's incredibly finicky and dies at the slightest inconvenience. And that's exactly what happened to us. But this time we bought probably the most indestructible plant, a ficus. Specifically this kind of ficus bonsai in a pot. And to make sure it doesn't experience stress during the transplant, they sold us a little liquid for that purpose. Little by little, we started bringing soil back into the terrarium and at the same time building a large underground cave for the herbivorous animals. Its roof became this large flat stone. And on the opposite side, under a smaller stone, we made a cave for the predator. The entrance to the large cave was a narrow crevice that only its inhabitants could squeeze through. We don't want the predator to kill all its prey at once and then die of hunger. Day 5. We started working on the water part of the terrarium. It's more of a separate ecosystem rather than part of the whole. For it, food chains need to be built with aquatic plants and aquatic animals. But first, let's decide how this aquarium will look. As we remember, the crayfish destroyed that beautiful garden that was here, which is why they faced eviction. This time, we wanted to try making a green carpet across the entire bottom of the water body. By the way, this time the substrate in the terrarium will be regular soil. It's not only a much more pleasant and nutritious substrate for the plants, but it also looks a lot more like a real natural water body with the kinds of plants we will have. We laid out the bottom, and we covered this mowed back wall of the water body with moist soil and lightly compacted it. And while there shouldn't be any problems with planting the plants at the bottom, for planting on the wall, we had to get the gauze dirty with soil so it wouldn't stand out against the background. Then we placed it on the back wall of the water body, pressing it down with soil. We pressed the soil at the bottom of the water body with sand and small pebbles so that it wouldn't get washed away either. In marl, we cut many identical holes into which we securely planted small pieces of a plant like this. The idea is for it to spread across the entire bottom area and create a beautiful green carpet. After half an hour of arguing, it was added. And here is such a beautiful spreading snag. Or, as my partner said, a crooked gorge that is not needed there, damn it. But in my opinion, it looks better with it. What do you think? Next, we move on to the familiar process of planting aquarium plants. Carefully, we pour a few centimeters of water into the dish. We place the tall plants at the back so they don't block the view, and the low bushes in the middle. After that, we fill the water to the edge. If you watched the previous video about this terrarium, you can imagine what a nightmare this water was like. Over the next 2 weeks, this time the explosion in the number of bacteria was particularly strong. Most likely, it's because of the black soil used as the substrate, which contains about 10 billion bacteria in every gram. But as expected, it won. The population of good bacteria increased and the water became clear. But a large part of it still needed to be changed because the beautiful sprawling driftwood stained it brown.
Below, there, lower.
But I still don't regret leaving it. Day 22. The walls of the aquarium have managed to get covered with green algae, and the snails that settled in first along with the plants have already laid their eggs. Here's such a long clutch. And look at how many living creatures you can see, by slightly enlarging this tiny world on 2 square centimeters of the glass wall. But it seems our ecosystem has decided for us how it will look. We can forget about the beautiful green carpet. The pieces we planted just dissolved while establishing balance in the water feature. Day 26. We did change the water after all. Specifically, we performed what's called a super water change. This technique involves draining the water almost completely and then refilling it to the brim several times in a row. And the water feature, finally, it has taken on a beautiful appearance. We also trimmed the aquatic and terrestrial plants, including our ficus, and started stocking the animals. The first to explore their new home were a few Zophobus beetles. They hatched from the larvae we filmed. The beetles settled in pretty quickly and checked out absolutely every spot. Terrarium, for the time being, we covered the top of the terrarium with plastic wrap to maintain the necessary humidity level and to make sure no one crawls out of it. And it seems like it worked faster than we could have thought. The next day, a yellow mushroom like this grew in the terrarium. So there are no problems with humidity. A few days later, it was time to introduce the main resident of the terrarium, you could say, the top of our short food chain. Here it is. More specifically, it's a young female tarantula. This one can live up to 15 years and eat about 1 cockroach roughly once a week. Our spider turned out to have quite a personality, so before settling her in, we decided to feed her one more time just in case. And she didn't refuse the fatty Zophobus larva. We carefully moved her into the terrarium and we immediately showed her her new lair. At first she crawled in completely the wrong direction. We gently blew on the spider and she quickly adjusted her course. The spider carefully crawled into the cave, leaving a trail of silk behind her. After which she buried her head in the corner of the cave and froze. So, now we needed to think about a food source for her. Mold grew while idle. Isopods couldn't keep up. They either don't eat this mold or couldn't match its growth. But the midges, whose job it is to clean the terrarium of such uninvited guests, failed to cope. Either they don't eat this particular type of mold, or they just couldn't keep up with the pace of its growth. In such conditions, even cockroaches wouldn't want to live. So we took a risky step and placed our quartz ultraviolet lamp by the cave. Its light kills all living things. It simply destroys the DNA of living organisms. And neither microbes nor fungi can reproduce at all. We carefully covered everything from its light except for the cave, and after a few hours, all the mold should have been neutralized. But we decided to hold off on introducing the cockroaches. Day 30. At night, I approached the terrarium to check on how the spider was doing. And before I could even rub my eyes, I ran after the spider. The female spider just killed one of the beetles living in the terrarium. He probably crawled into the cave, unaware of what was waiting for him there. He was still moving when I got closer, but the poison was already spreading through its primitive veins, turning its insides into a beetle smoothie for our predator. The spider carried the victim to a suitable place and began gluing him to the floor with her web. But then, it seems she changed her mind and immediately started to eat, grabbing it with her chelicerae. I didn't want to distract her with bright lights, so I left her alone. In this state, our terrarium lasted for another month. We are the spider. We occasionally fed him cockroaches, which he wasn't very eager to take from our hands, preferring instead to hunt on his own or wait until they crawled into his lair. Day 60. Until they crawl into his lair. Day 60? The film, as expected, successfully performed its functions. We never had to humidify the terrarium. The evaporated water simply condensed on the film and the walls and flowed back into the ground, or into the water part of the terrarium. No animal escaped, just as no plant died from lack of water. Even on the contrary, the fastest growing species have already produced seeds to give life to a new generation, but the vegetables for some reason didn't grow very well. On the contrary, the fastest growing species have already produced seeds to give life to a new generation. But the vegetables didn't grow very well. The only edible thing I've seen in the terrarium is lettuce. In the aquatic part of the terrarium, complete balance has finally been achieved. The water became clear and the plants were doing great. And then we decided to introduce fish into the tank. The choices were very limited. After all, after the ecosystem is sealed, there will be no devices in it, including a water aerator. So the vast majority of fish would suffocate there within the first couple of days. For this reason, we chose marble corridoras. After all, these are the so-called labyrinth fish. They are adapted to survive in such warm and oxygen-poor bodies of water. These fish can breathe not only the oxygen dissolved in water, but also regular air by gulping it from the surface. We took 4 males and 2 females in the hope that they would be able to breed. Besides these dominant aquatic predators, we decided to try adding apple snails and shrimp there. They are supposed to serve the same function as pillbugs in the terrestrial part of the ecosystem. Of course, the chance that the fish won't eat them on the first day is very small, but on the other hand, we planted quite a lot of plants. Very small, but on the other hand, we planted quite a lot of plants, and there might be enough quiet spots for the shrimp among them to hide from the fish. And there may be enough quiet corners for shrimp among them to hide from the fish. Shrimp, we of course introduced them first to give them time to settle in and hide. By the way, it seems we've introduced an uninvited guest, or it was already in the aquarium. Maybe you know what kind of animal this is. Yes, worms are animals. They move actively and are consumers, meaning they feed on other organisms. These 2 traits actually unite all animals. Fish, we were still feeding them dry food, and 3 more weeks went by. Day 83. We removed the film from the terrarium again and immediately saw an ant that came to fish. And quite successfully. And how did this hunter manage to catch such a nimble and agile snail from the water? Yeah, no way. It just crawled onto a leaf and sat there just like these guys. Look how the overgrown aquatic plants have covered the surface of the water with their leaves. Not only an ant can walk on them now, but even a beetle was firmly standing on its legs. We didn't want to disturb it. After waiting a bit, we returned to the terrarium. We trimmed the plants again and decided to replant the vegetables. We uprooted the old plants, leveled the soil, and planted new seeds. The ant, by the way, didn't miss the chance to grab a few seeds. After all, this species is more like farmers than hunters. We didn't remove all the old vegetation from the ecosystem. Instead, we laid it down on the ground in a mowed form. After all, these plants took nutrients from the soil that helped them grow. Therefore, they depleted the soil. And now they will return all that nutrients to the earth. Of course, they won't do it on their own. This is where the decomposers come into play. Different creatures from earthworms to tiny bacteria break down organic matter step by step into mineral compounds, that is, into fertilizers that new plants will use in the future. This process doesn't only happen at low temperatures, when all the decomposers in the soil go dormant, but it works independently of light. The presence of oxygen in the earth and in water, and here are the cut parts of the plants from the water. We went ahead and removed it, because when it decomposes in the water, it will surely get cloudy and eventually turn into a swamp. Yeah, and the aquatic plants were growing really fast. Probably in the Chernozem, which acts as the substrate, there are too many fertilizers. And this entire aquarium could eventually be overgrown with grass. That same day, we finally decided to populate the terrarium with a food source for the spider. We chose Argentine cockroaches. They reproduce slowly, so they won't be able to take over the entire terrarium, and they can comfortably live in the cave and can't crawl on glass. We put a little carrot in their cave and carefully, well, not really, we transferred all the little cockroaches straight in through the funnel. They explored their new apartments and didn't even pay attention to the beetles that had been living in the terrarium for a couple of months, so the main primary consumers on land have been settled. They explored their new apartments and didn't even pay attention to the beetles that had been living in the terrarium for a couple of months. So the main primary consumers on land have been settled. But what about the water? Our fish are not herbivores. They also need a food source. Of course, they can occasionally snack on a cockroach that wandered in the wrong place and drowned. But for a good life, they needed their own aquatic food. And we thought these guys were the best option. These are the eggs of Daphnia, tiny crustaceans that feed on single-celled algae and bacteria. We filled this little bag with water and just left it floating in the aquarium. 2 days later, the first little crustaceans hatched from the eggs. The white dots you see right now are not them, they're their eggs, fused together. The little crustaceans are still very small. Here they are, almost invisible to the naked eye. Another 6 days later, the little crustaceans had fully grown. And we moved them to a big bag and fed them with yeast dissolved in hot water. Just like our prehistoric shield bugs. A week later, there were so many little crustaceans. You could gather quite a bit with just a couple of spoonfuls. Here's such a thick cloud of Daphnia. But still, there aren't enough of them, a lot, so that after introducing them into the aquarium, the fish wouldn't eat them all in just a few minutes. By this point, things in the terrarium started to grow actively. These yellow mushrooms. And actually, there are already quite a lot of them. I hope they don't take over our entire ecosystem. All the animals were alive, and from the cut, decaying vegetation, new green shoots broke through. Day 119. Well, the time has come for us to close our terrarium and leave for the whole summer. By this point, the terrarium has changed a bit. The dominant plant has become these thickets that look like either carrots or dill. And they even grew these little seed pods. We removed the filter from the water section of the terrarium, which had been there for a long time. We added a bit more water and thoroughly cleaned the glass walls. Terrarium? We also took care to ensure that we can clean the terrarium from the inside even after it's fully sealed. We took this hard part from a dishwashing sponge and sewed 2 flat neodymium magnets inside it. We ended up with this magnetic scraper. It will always be inside the terrarium and we'll control it with another magnet. From the outside, now no dirt or algae on the glass will obstruct our view. Then, we introduced the Daphnia. When the big bag became a bit cramped for them, we moved them to breed in a separate aquarium, where their population grew to many thousands of individuals. It's good that they naturally swim towards the light. It was very easy to gather all the Daphnia and move them to the fish. And as the final touch, we decided to add a starter food kit for the cockroaches. It was a sliced apple and pieces of bread that we placed in the cockroach cave. And now we're covering the terrarium with glass and sealing the joints with silicone all around the perimeter. Now it's really closed. The ecosystem only receives energy from outside in the form of light, because we can't create an artificial sun just yet. Our terrarium has been closed for 9 months now. Thank you so much for watching until this point. Give us a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and then there will be even more videos like this.